If you've listened to this podcast before, you know that sometimes I like to spend an episode just working out what's going on with some guy. Sometimes episodes about some guy are triggered because fame makes certain types of people go absolutely batshit crazy, and I just want to look at their Wikipedia page and mutter, "What the fuck?" to myself over and over again. But usually, it's because I've gone on a movie-watching binge and have become unreasonably fixated on what one guy is doing from film to film. In this case, it's because I went and saw The Lost City, which is a delightful rom-com with an insane cast starring Sandra Bullock, Channing Tatum, Daniel Radcliffe, Brad Pitt. So many guys to choose from, you know? So many rabbit holes to go down. And look, frankly, given how much I love Magic Mike XXL, the greatest film ever made, it wouldn't be surprising if you assumed that I was doing an episode on whatever Channing Tatum has going on. But I'm not. It's actually physically impossible for me to not be into a man with really long hair, and Brad Pitt has a beautiful wig on in this film. Obviously, I watched like 15 Brad Pitt films immediately afterwards, and I have some things that I want to unpack. I'm Alex, this is Pop Culture Boner, the podcast edition, and today I'm thinking about Brad Pitt. So, Brad Pitt's quite private by the standards of contemporary fame. He doesn't have social media. The interviews he does are really minimal, and they lean very heavily towards those kind of classical long-form profile pieces that are afforded to stars of a certain level. Even in a new media landscape, he rarely even pops up on the YouTube shows that are run by formerly print-only mastheads that have become mainstays of the publicity circuit now. Think like GQ's Iconic Characters show, where actors review high points of their career. In spite of this, the content mill still loves a little bit of Brad Pitt, and thousands of words are dedicated annually to picking at his life, career, and talent. I'm doing it right now. But I want you to think about how famous Brad Pitt is, and then compare it with how much you actually know about him. When I was telling my mum, a longtime Brad fan, or Bradley, as she calls him, about this episode and we spoke about his rise to fame, I was like, was he an underwear model? I feel like he was an underwear model. Turns out I was just confusing his washboard abs in Thelma and Louise with Calvin Klein ads from around the same era. He was not an underwear model. And look, I'm assuming someone listening to this podcast is a bigger Brad fan than me and is just shouting to themselves, Alex, he did bit parts in Dallas before hitting it big. And that's okay. But I think a more important point here is to think about how you know that. How much of the information you know about Brad Pitt feels like it was imparted directly to you from God's lips to your ears or whatever. In an era of celebrity where fame and influence can either mean you're in blockbuster films or that 200,000 people watch you put on makeup regularly, it's kind of interesting to think about how those different types of fame are actually embodied. Micro-celebrities and influencers often achieve their fame through intense documentation and detailing of their life, and the things you know about them are often spoken directly to you, or like into a front-facing camera that you're watching. You know what I mean. Anyway, that train of thought led me to the two things that I want to consider about Brad Pitt. The first is the nature of his fame. Why is Brad Pitt so enduringly popular? What is it about this man that has elevated him to perpetually discussed and mythologized icon? And then the second is perhaps the more obvious thing, which is Brad Pitt's beautiful face. Because I think it's been at least partially responsible for his longevity, and I want to give that square jaw some credit. But I also want to think about how his looks might have impacted the types of roles he was offered as his career was starting out, and how that might have changed now that he's almost 60. Yes, I'm back on my thinking about crumbling beauty and the decrepit male body bullshit again, but it's my podcast, and you cannot stop me. Let's get into it, shall we? So one of the things that you'll notice if you read any recent writing on Brad Pitt is that people tend to view him as emblematic of a particular type of old school fame that doesn't really exist anymore. When he appeared in Tarantino's Once Upon a Time in Hollywood back in 2019, Doreen St. Felix, a writer for The New Yorker, tweeted, "Brad Pitt is the last good-looking white man." While this might feel a little bit hyperbolic given our cultural obsession with beauty, I think it taps into something in the nostalgia fest that is Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. There's something kind of old Hollywood-esque about the way that Brad Pitt conducts himself. Even as he ages, beautifully, I might add, he's still almost universally recognizable in a way that's pretty much impossible to achieve now. In recent years, and with the advent of social media, our burning desire for some sort of perceived relationship to celebrity has forced a wave of increasingly accessible famous people, meaning that even established actors are often chattering away unfiltered on Instagram or Twitter. Pitt doesn't have that level of accessibility. Whatever perceptions of him we might have as charming or laid back or down to earth are filtered through really carefully curated interviews and speculative pieces of tabloid fiction. He said himself in his first Rolling Stone cover story, "The truth is, I don't want people to know me. I don't know a thing about my favorite actors. I don't think you should." Then they just become personalities. The rest of the cover story is suitably mythologizing, less interview, more recount of being dragged through the Glaswegian bar scene by a handsome and charming drifter. I think there's probably something of a bleeding of Brad Pitt personal mythology and Brad Pitt's screen presence. The role that everyone considers to have made Brad Pitt's career is as JD in Thelma and Louise, an impossibly beautiful, slightly dangerous, and endlessly charming drifter who delivers the delightful line, "I've always believed that done properly, armed robbery doesn't have to be a totally unpleasant experience." He does, of course, rob Louise of her life savings while the two women sleep. Obviously, Thelma and Louise is a modern classic, beyond simply being a good movie. It's also a notable example of a film where the female characters have a significant inner life and whose interactions are driven by friendship rather than competition, something which has tragically not become all that much more common since the film's release in 1991. In that context, a beautiful man who isn't the main plot feature could really have been played by anyone in Hollywood hitting the conventional 90s beauty standards, but it's significant that Brad Pitt is it. His overall physique is leaner than the rigors of the 80s cinematic male body typically demanded, and more importantly, it's kind of vulnerable. He stands shirtless in his jeans and cowboy hat, posing with a hairdryer as a gun, but also he listens to what Thelma has to say, and he appears to care about their time together. Manuela Lanzic, writing for The Ringer, sees Pitt's role in this film as important specifically because he's designed purely to be looked at. She argues that action bodies aren't emotional, they're sort of geared for physical danger, whereas Brad Pitt's JD is offering a body that's available for visual pleasure and for emotional intelligence. She says, JD's embracing of his superficial appeal and of people's emotions makes him sexually liberated and liberating. While this changing understanding of cinematic masculinity marks a significant shift in popular and marketable attraction, that obviously doesn't exist in a vacuum, and you can kind of map the changes that Lanzic outlines through other action genre movies that came out in the same year. My beloved and incredibly homoerotic Point Break, for one. But I think his role in Thelma and Louise really cemented something fundamental about how we understand Brad Pitt's presence on screen, which would serve as a foundation stone for future roles and shape how we've come to understand his career. While Pitt is undeniably handsome, there's also something oddly malleable in the way that we view his masculinity. In Thelma and Louise, his character is kind of a flipped version of a femme fatale. His softened presentation of masculinity represents a tempting new sexual ideal, promising pleasure that is both sensual and emotional, even if it's a little dangerous. The square jaw and the washboard abs are coupled with a pouted lower lip and a furrowed brow as he listens intently to stories of feminine woe. That same spirit carries over into his other movies. The sculpted body never quite means what it's supposed to. In the years immediately following his turn as JD, Pitt's two biggest roles, the ones which continued to cement his place as a bankable star, were in Legends of the Fall and Interview with a Vampire, in which he plays two characters who outlive everyone they've ever loved, often due to circumstances that they have inadvertently played a hand in. They're odd choices for someone so golden, I guess would be the word I would use. Like, Pitt's a glowing, tanned farm boy from Missouri. And yet here he is, surrounded by the carnage of everyone else's miserable end in Legends of the Fall, or reclining in melancholic homoerotic agony in Interview with a Vampire. It's almost in direct opposition to how we feel Pitt should be appearing based on his physical being. Elizabeth Abeel argues that these roles set Pitt up as a romantic hero in the literary sense. As a quick and dirty Wikipedia definition for the unfamiliar, a romantic hero is a character that rejects the established norms of a civilized society and is in turn rejected. They're often lightly tortured and tragic, full of regret and introspection, even as their powerful presence often kind of draws people towards them. Abeel suggests that throughout his career, many of Pitt's roles are imbued with the type of values that classify them as romantic in this classical sense, and that they use his physical beauty to contrast with the traditional expectations of masculinity on the screen. In my recent Brad Pitt binge, I rewatched Mr. and Mrs. Smith, aka the film that sparked all the Brad is cheating on his wife with Angelina Jolie rumours. The pair play married assassins who don't realise that they're working for rival companies, having told each other elaborate lies and married each other ostensibly for a sense of normalcy. Aside from the spicy chemistry, the thing that stuck out for me on this rewatch was how submissive Pitt's character is. When he finds out his wife might be trying to kill him, he tests her, believing that she won't blow up the elevator she thinks he's in because she cares about him. And when she does it anyway, he becomes melancholic and vows to take her out, but ultimately can't do it. With guns to each other's heads, he surrenders, saying, "Go on, I can't do it. You want it more. You pull the trigger." He's consistently bested by his wife, but the thing that ultimately overcomes her is the fact that he's being vulnerable with her, although she initially finds it repulsive and she hangs up on him when he confesses that it was love at first sight. The whole setup is antithetical to the masculine conventions of the assassin genre that moviegoers are usually presented with, but he does also have that romantic hero essence in that his personal code here is so strong that he's willing to die for it. Pitt's handsome physical presence is underpinned by a softness that makes the lead character feel more nuanced. If you had told me when that film came out in 2005 that I would be thinking about it in the same sentence as the words Byronic hero, I would have been like, I don't fully understand what a Byronic hero is. I'm 15. Anyway, life and English degrees come at you fast. I think the combination of Bradley's beautiful face and carefully curated, lightly mysterious off-screen persona have led a lot of people, myself included probably, to read complexity into even the blandest of his roles. It's kind of easy to forget, given his longevity as a successful and continuously employable star, that many of Pitt's roles were critical failures, even if they weren't commercial ones. Which brings me to my favourite thing that's ever been written about Brad Pitt. Alison Willmore's piece for BuzzFeed in 2019 titled "Brad Pitt is a character actor trapped in a movie star's body." The piece notes that Brad is an extremely talented actor, but that all of his best roles have been supporting character parts, and that often when he's pushed into the kinds of conventional leading roles that one might expect from a man with his face, that he suddenly becomes a blank canvas where a person should be. Her argument is not that Brad Pitt is at war with his looks, but rather reveling in them in specific cinematic contexts. The interesting thing about his career in her mind is that the context in which he's seemed most comfortable shifting focus to his looks is as an object of envy or resentment for other men, pulling focus on their desire to embody their own masculinity through his own. He is, as she says, a character actor in a movie star's body. Willmore uses Fight Club and Once Upon a Time in Hollywood as examples, specifically because they both deploy Pitt's looks as something violent and toxic, poorly papered over with the aspirational ideal of masculinity. I would also argue that they're two of Pitt's most misread roles, but that's a separate episode on the concept of red flag films and the willful misinterpretation of complex literary and cinematic concepts by incels. I think the best summary of Brad Pitt's skill as a bit player is his role as personal trainer Chad Feldheimer in the Coen brothers' Burn After Reading, a film about misunderstandings, the CIA, and a man trying to write his memoirs in peace. Aside from the fact that this movie is hilarious and wildly underrated, it's also one of the best things I've ever seen Brad Pitt do. He plays a frosted-tipped, gum-chewing himbo, constantly in search of hydration, specifically from Gatorade, none of that swamp water. He's more animated than he's ever been, and most importantly, he's funny. I think because of his face, people assume that Brad Pitt couldn't possibly nail comedic timing. Probably because that seems like you would have had to have made some sort of Crossroads-based devil pact to both look like that and be an actor versatile enough to nail comedy and drama. But I digress. Pitt was 45 by the time this film came out, and at that stage I'd argue that he'd spent the better part of his career trying to avoid being typecast based on his face. In this role, he embraces being of ripped physique and golden skin, specifically so that he can play up the buffoonery of that character. And it works. He steals every scene he's in, and critics and audiences loved him. Compare that to his role in The Curious Case of Benjamin Button, which came out in the same year. It did garner Pitt an Oscar nomination, but despite being in the title role, he's arguably the least memorable thing about that film after the art direction and Cate Blanchett's yearning looks. Obviously, there's a certain security that Brad Pitt's now afforded, having reached solid ground in a notoriously fickle industry. He could be pickier or more whimsical in his role choices if he wants to be, which I think is how we've ended up with a scene-stealing turn in The Lost City. I think as a younger actor, he likely had to prove that he was able to be the key player while also reassuring everyone around him that he could be something more than just beautiful. Ironically, I think he's actually done this by playing on his looks, but I think in allowing himself to comfortably take smaller and often funnier roles, where he's allowed to go a bit ham, we're actually being treated to the best bits of Brad's career. Well, those are my sweet baby Bradley thoughts. You should actually go and see The Lost City. It was really funny. I don't want to give the game away, but he has the best line in the whole film. Also, Channing Tatum's ass is right there, and he's really put some work into those sculpted cheeks. So it would be a shame for you not to go and see that on the large screen. If you've got thoughts on Brad's best role, or just like, I don't know, Channing Tatum's meaty ass cheeks, talk to me about it next time you see me in the pub. Peace.